Welcome everyone to Virtual Insights. Madalena Santos Reinbolt, a head full of planets. I'm Mathilde Walker-Bio. I'm creator of programs at the American Folk Art Museum. A quick note that closed captioning in English is available today by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. I'm joining you today from Queens, New York, and I want to acknowledge that our museum stands upon Lenapehoking, the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples. We honor Lenape people, past, present, and future, and are committed to centering indigenous perspectives in exhibitions and programs at the museum. So the American Folk Art Museum is thrilled to present a new exhibition, Madalena Santos Reinbolt, A Head Full of Planets, now on view at 2 Lincoln Square until May 25th, along with a new rotation of the collection-based exhibition, Somewhere to Roost. With 42 textile works and oil paintings, Madalena Santos Reinbolt, A Head Full of Planets, is the first comprehensive survey of the artist's work ever presented. Born in Brazil in 1912, Santos Reinbolt is best known today for large-scale embroideries made from hundreds of colored threads, which the artist referred to as quadros de la wall paintings. This landmark exhibition is organized by the Museo de Arte de São Paulo, Assis Chateaubriand, where it debuted in fall 2022 and where it was curated by Amanda Carneiro and Andre Mesquita. At the American Folk Art Museum, the exhibition is curated by Valérie Rousseau with Dylan Blau Edelstein. And you can see now a view of the exhibition. So today I'm pleased to be joined by my two colleagues. We will walk us through this vibrant exhibition, the artworks and the themes included in the gallery. Dylan Blau Edelstein is a PhD candidate at Princeton University in Spanish and Portuguese, and is currently a curatorial fellow at the American Folk Art Museum. His research broadly investigates marginalized centers of modernist production and the intersections of cultural, artistic, and psychiatric practices in 20th century Brazil. Valérie Rousseau is curatorial chair for exhibitions and senior curator at the American Folk Art Museum. She overviewed critically acclaimed exhibitions, notably When the Curtain Never Comes Down, Brut in America, The Incursion of Jean Dubuffet, Photo Brut, Maurice Hirschfeld Rediscovered, as well as projects on the legacy of psychiatrist Francesc Toscayes and on neurodiversity. This curatorial walkthrough will be an opportunity to hear more about their research and fieldwork findings while looking at the artist's oeuvre through a variety of lenses. And before I hand it over to our speakers, let me go over a few technicalities. This program will last about an hour. There will be time for Q&A. So please share your question for our speakers throughout the talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And I'll be using the chat room to share more details about the program and our speakers. And if you need any additional information, please drop me a line. Please know that today's program is being recorded and will be made available online the coming weeks. And again, closed captioning in English is available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Our museum is grateful for opportunities like this program to connect online, which will not be possible without you all. So I hope you will consider supporting our programs through a donation to the museum following this conversation. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our speakers. Hi, Dylan. Hi, Valérie. Thank you for being here. And
Hello.
please take it away. I'll see you after the talk.
Thank you, Mathilde. Thank you for everyone who is able to join us today, this afternoon, for this presentation of the exhibition Madalena Santos Reinbolt, A Head Full of Planets. So I'm going to start with an overview of who the artist is and the way we have framed the exhibition curatorially. So Madalena Santos Reinbolt, as a start, she was born in 1912 in Vitória da Conquista. It's a rural town in the northeast of Brazil in the state of Bahia. And she died in 1976 in Petrópolis, which is a mountain getaway favored by Brazilian high society and where she was a live-in cook and a housekeeper in various households. Santos Reinbolt's artistic practice crystallized more specifically in the early 1950s as she worked for the architect Lota de Macedo Soares and her partner, the American poet Elizabeth Bishop, at their house in Petrópolis. There, Santos Reinbolt painted in her spare time, rendering scenes with expressive brushstrokes in oil on paper and canvas. And in the mid 1960s, while working in another household, she began to dedicate herself to embroidery. The exhibition, titled A Head Full of Planets, derives from the only interviews known to have been given by Santos Reinbolt. These interviews were conducted in 1974 and 75 by the art critic and anthropologist Lelia Coelho-Frota, who would go on to include as well her works in the Brazilian pavilion of the 1978 Venice Biennial, marking her exhibition debut. And throughout the exhibition, we have carried over the voice of the artist with quotes from these interviews, and the only known source on Madalena Santos Reinbolt by herself. So the exhibition title, The Head Full of Planet, can be understood as a form of knowledge that bridges multiple realms. It speaks to the artist's insistence on her fertile inner world that was set against a backdrop of class inequality and demanding labor, which in return, we came to realize that it limited her exposure at the time to the art circuits and prevented her certainly from embracing a fuller artistic career. The exhibition in Santos is Santos Reinbolt's first solo show in the United States. It was organized by MASPI, the Art Museum of Sao Paulo Assis Chateaubriand, and their curators Amanda Carneiro and Andres Mesquita. With my colleague Dylan, we expanded for this presentation at AFAM on MASPI's important research, adding new findings and adapting its content for American audiences likely unfamiliar with the art of Santos Reinbolt. The exhibition is composed of 42 of our paintings, so oil on canvas and paper, and quadros dela, that we can translate in Portuguese by wool paintings, a term that the artist herself used to describe her embroideries. This is almost, as we realize, the half of her output. Indeed, as of 2024, only around 90 of her works have been identified. So our visitors will discover her art through plural lenses, including gender, race, and socioeconomic dynamics, repositioning Santos Reinbolt's body of work within a richer perspective, honoring diverse cultural legacies and artistic training. We have, for instance, compiled a substantial exhibition history and bibliography that is placed in a QR code in the first gallery of the exhibition. So we could therefore put our artistic impact in a perspective and better understand how this self-taught figure must have influenced the formation of 20th century Brazilian art. So right from the introduction gallery of the exhibition, there are two labels, and these two labels clearly frame our interpretation on things as simple as dates and titles attached to each works. Such information is too often taken for granted, but required spatial scrutiny when working on artists like Santos Reinbolt, for whom we have very little first-hand testimonies. The first label here, we have the work to which it is attached. So what we try to say is that through even though the fact that the artist at the art of the exhibition is generally referred as by the name of Madalena Santos Reinbolt, her signatures reveal other possibilities, including Madalena Maria Souza and Madalena Souza Reinbolt. The Portuguese surnames Souza and Santos came from her parents. The name Reinbolt came from her husband, Luis Augusto Reinbolt, whom she married in 1952, just at the moment she transitioned from a family to another one in Petrópolis. He was of German descent, like many residents of Petrópolis, a city that, as I said, in addition to serving as a cool summer retreat in the mountain for wealthy Brazilians, it has long been a pole of German immigration. The whiteness of the city, and I think we should not minimize this fact, makes the racialization in her work all the most compelling. So in this exhibition, dates and titles of artworks, as you see here, are indicated if the artist inscribed them on her works, on the back of her works, or on embroidered them on the front of her artworks. The wider date span is used in reference to the years she lived in certain residences in Petrópolis. Recent interviews with people who knew Santos Reinbolt have uncovered new dates, new titles, and new life circumstances. Ongoing research continues to disclose new information, providing a deeper understanding of her practice and intentions. Only recently, for instance, was the exact date of her birth determined, her birth and her death determined, which is something we have added in our interpretation. A second label in the introduction is devoted to her creative process, her vocabulary, and her technique. And I'm going to cite her from this interview that she had with Coelho Frota, and it's a quote that we have enlarged in the first gallery. It says, "I work everything out in my head. I can see I can see it all even with my eyes closed. Really, it's the needles that are doing the drawing. For example, I'll do everything in black. Then I'll want to do it all in blue. So I grab my blue needles. Or I'll want to use yellow. So I grab the yellow threaded needles. And I'll stitch away until I end up with this colorful thing." End of the quote. So she made paintings from the late 1940s through the late 1960s, but it was really her transition to into embroideries, like the ones you see on the screen, a practice that she maintained from the mid 1960s until her death in 1976. This is really that practice that truly gained the attention of the art world. Before starting an embroidery, more technically, Santos Reinbolt would thread over 100 needles with different colors of wool yarn or jute fibers. That way they were at the ready, like a painter's palette, if you want. She says, referring to her process, I repeat what she said earlier, "I've never traced anything out. I do things in my head." So according to members of the family for whom she worked as a cook for the last 16 years of her life, and that my colleague Dylan had a chance to interview, Santos Reinbolt was initially encouraged to make her embroidery on fabric. However, she quickly switched to burlap, cut from the sacks that she and her husband collected from local warehouses. Interestingly, this choice of material affected the scale of her work. As you see here, she maximized the surface of her embroidery using the full scale of the sack. Also, we can imagine that the irregular and flexible mesh allowed her greater freedom and expressiveness. From the introduction space in which we are here, We therefore decided to hang that specific piece from ceiling, so it could be seen double-sided on both sides, and revealed the materials, the main materials that she has used, in this case, burlap. We see also that the back of the work looks as good as the front, that she's not carrying the thread, for instance, like many stitchers like her were probably obsessed with the back of the needlework being as perfect as the front. So it suggests that she learned her craft within certain traditional contexts, which brings me to the first section of the exhibition that is titled Intersecting Existences, Artist, Domestic Worker, and Black Woman. So in this section, we made the point that Santos Reinbolt made art long before arrival in Petrópolis around 1949, when she is 37 years old, where she worked as a cook for Lota de Macedo Soares and Elizabeth Bishop, among other families. Growing up on a small farm in rural Bahia, where her family notably grew cotton, she learned from the skilled craftsmanship of her parents, watching her mother make pottery, blankets, linen, and lace. We learned from her interview that when she was young, she would paint on newspaper with green sap that she extracted from leaves, using chicken feathers as a drawing tool. And as you enter the gallery, you will see that from that section that we have divided the exhibition in very like fluid sections, 4 sections that can overlap each other in terms of contents and themes. The works are not presented chronologically, but rather they present Madalena as a visual thinker, and we are according predominance to our compositional choices and recurrent subjects. And I'm going to just give an example here of the work, one of the works that you see in the first section that is untitled, created in 1969. So if we compare, and on purpose, I started with this piece, one of my favorites in the exhibition. So, but if we compare Santos Reinbolt with self-taught artist, well known by our American audiences, we can say that she's not so much a memory painter like would be identified to Grandma Moses, for instance, but her compositions bear resemblance with an artist like Bill Traylor, who combined events and references from various temporalities. Santos Reinbolt's painting and embroideries are often filled, like you see here in this example, are filled with celestial bodies, shiny stars, full moons, bright suns in various variations of shapes. Some of them are surrounded by halos. So I picked a quote from this interview with Koyo Fruta, in which she referred to a work similar to this one, but it's not exactly this one, but it shows very well the way she approached the subjects and how she might have combined these various temporalities or entering in dialogue with the works as she making it. So she explained, this wool painting is of a big farm. On the farm, there's an angel and a little bird. I don't know why, but an angel appeared there above the bulls, right by the sun. The farmhouse is really old, and all these people live on the farm. There was also a big green bird that appeared there by the sun. I love the sun and the moon, all 2 of them. End of quote. And another example, here where you see the skies. So when we look at our skies, they aesthetically recall the wave patterns of Brazilian modernist Roberto Buller Marx, a famous landscape artist and architect who has a garden estate near Rio de Janeiro, and who was said to be painting his gardens. So I wanted to show you this image, and you will really pay attention to, in the coming slides, to the quality of our skies, and often using these geometrical formations. So I'm going to invite Dylan to talk further about race dynamics and in this first section of the exhibition. Dylan, thank you.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for that, Valerie. Again, my name is Dylan Blau Edelstein, and part of my work for this exhibition entailed a 2-month trip to Brazil this summer, where I was able to do on-the-ground research on Madalena, which included finding the cemetery where she was buried, so helping to determine some dates of life and death, as well as finding a number of people who knew her and who lived with her 50 years ago, right? So before her death in 1976. But I'm going to kind of stitch some of those reflections throughout my talk today. And so just to reiterate a point that Valérie began to make, Madalena was born in Vitória da Conquista, a kind of rural city in the state of Bahia, in the northeast. She grew up on this subsistence farm, where her mother made pottery and linens and was engaged in artistic practices that Madalena would return to later on in life. And then she migrated from this small town, first to Salvador, the capital of Bahia, then to Rio de Janeiro, and then finally in Sao Paulo, and then finally Petrópolis. So she's partaking in this big movement of migrants from the northeast of the country down to the southeast in search of employment and fleeing droughts that were taking place in the country at the time. And so in this first section, again, we've highlighted the intersections, right, between her experiences as a domestic worker, an artist, as a woman, as a Black person. And we can see this manifesting in a number of ways in her works, right? So thematically throughout the show, you'll see lots of mountains throughout her works, which will reflect a number of the different places through which she passed, including Petrópolis, which again is in the mountains, just outside of, about an hour from the city of Rio. You see the ocean, which is reflecting the city of Salvador or other places where she lived in Bahia. Her works are also featuring a range of racialized bodies. Some of them are intermingled, kind of giving a sense of a racial harmony at the others. And in other works, we see very stark divisions where Black people are here, white people are represented off to the side. So I think she offers a lot of opportunities to reflect on these elements of identity within her work. I'd also like to know, you can't see it that well, but on the leftmost wool painting that she has here, we see a scene of a set table. And I think we can think about that set table, as well as there are tables that appear in at least one or two other works, where we can think about that in terms of the fact that she is working as a live-in cook for families. And there are other works that you'll see later in the exhibition where she represents women with fish on their head. And you can think about that also as a woman going to get ingredients to bring home to cook. This intersection of identities is also affecting the sort of research that can be done on Madalena. So as a migrant, right, she can't travel with much. She left very few traces in the archives. A lot of what we know comes from letters by her employer, Elizabeth Bishop, that she sent back to friends in the United States, or from Lelia Coelho Frota's published essay on this artist. And within that essay, we get these two portraits here that I think we can extract a lot of information from. So I'd like to take one moment to first consider this portrait on the left. And I think it invites a lot of questions. So was she posed by this unidentified photographer? Did she know a camera was present? In one of my interviews, I learned that she would often wear head wraps when she was working. So is this a photo that was taken in a moment of work? Or is this something that she also would wear when she wasn't working? It is worth noting that there's a really long history of representing Afro-Brazilian women with head wraps in kind of visual culture in Brazil as a visual marker of working class or enslaved status. So this goes back to 19th century lithographs by travelers like Debré to Brazil. And so at the same time, The image we have here on the right, this portrait of Madalena, which was taken in 1974 and 1975, it's reproduced in our very first gallery. And if you come to the exhibition, I'd invite you to take a moment to just kind of sit with it, because I think it's rather impressive, right? She's looking right into the camera. She has a confident expression. Next to her, she has this stack of her embroideries that have been kind of thrown there, not treated particularly preciously. She also appears to have prepared herself. She's combed her hair. She's done her nails. She's wearing all these necklaces that have a kind of variety of crosses and a face of Jesus. And she also has this very floral dress that reflects a lot of the motifs in her work. So I think we might ask, is this how she wanted to be remembered? And then particularly on the topic of dress, and you can go to the next slide, Valérie. One detail that emerged in my interviews is the fact that Madalena often made her own clothing. And she surely would have learned this skill from her mother, who created linens and all sorts of fabrics. But apparently Madalena would then take leftover scraps from clothing that she was making and incorporate them into her embroideries, often as outfits for different characters. And so no, actually, we'll stay on this slide for now. Sorry. And then on that note, then the last topic I'd like to consider thinking about domestic work is how her domestic work affected her ability to create. So on the one hand, the fact that she was creating art seems to have created a lot of tensions with her employer, Elizabeth Bishop, who writes in a letter that she had to fire Madalena because she was devoting too much time to her art and not enough to cooking. And I think that might push us into thinking about her domestic labor as something that was rather oppressive and made it hard for her to create. But at the same time, we've learned that Madalena moved from this house with Elizabeth Bishop and Lota de Macedo Soares to another home nearby, which was a vacation home, first owned by the writers Tarquínio de Souza and Lucia Miguel Pereira, and then by a family of the name, the Buarque de Faria family. And the fact that this was a vacation home, I think, might help us to see how her status as a domestic worker, like within that status, she was able to find some agency, because during most of the year, these families weren't there. And so she would have, all the works that are featured in our exhibition were created during a time where she had probably a fair amount of freedom over how she was spending her time. So next gallery shot. And so this next gallery space that we're moving into here, the main theme that we're addressing here is on questions of religion and spirituality. And thinking back, you can go to the next picture, Valérie, thinking to the relationship she had to her employers, Madalena made a number of works for a number of the children in the family. And so this one in particular was made for Lilian, who was one of the daughters in the family, on the occasion of her 3rd birthday. And so in the center there, you can see a cake with the little number 3 on the top on a candle. And thinking about this in relationship to the theme of religion and spirituality, towards the top of the image, you see a number of angels that are kind of guarding Lilian on this day for her birthday, which is reflective of Madalena's Catholic background. And in a number of the other works in this section, you will see more angels, you'll see crosses, churches. And in this regard, we should note that in Madalena's interview with Lélio Coelho Frota, she says, "My religion is that of the church, and I'll stick with it till the end. I never jump to another, not to candomblé or spiritism. The saints of my devotion are Jesus Christ and Our Lady Aparecida. In my work, you can see the presence of God." And so honing in on that second sentence there, right, she explicitly rejects candomblé, which, like voodoo in New Orleans or Santeria in the Caribbean, is an Afro-Brazilian religion that derives from Yoruba traditions in West Africa. So she's explicitly taking distance from that. However, we should also note that she was giving this interview to Lélio Coelho Frota at the time of a military dictatorship in Brazil that took place between the 60s and the 80s, when Black religious practices were particularly stigmatized. So I think that we might want to take these statements with a grain of salt. And one kind of new direction, I think, for scholarship to think about are the ways that these religious practices may have influenced her work, even if she's not particularly identifying with them. Next slide. And so I'd like to thank the researcher Amanda Tavares, who pointed out to us that this butterfly motif that we see in a number of her works also look a lot like machados de Xangô, which are axes belonging to Xangô, who is the Orisha of justice, or this deity in Yoruba-based religions. And so whether or not this was her intention, we can't know. But I think this gets back to, again, this kind of way in which she escapes the archive, and we have very few testimonies, and this requires us to engage in a lot of speculation when thinking about her artworks. And I'll turn back over to you, Valérie.
Okay, so here we are entering the last gallery of the exhibition, which present two sections, but I'm going to just spend more time to walk you through the recurrent motifs and her compositions. So here you have two great examples. So in scenes ranging from farm life to crowded cityscapes, Madalena will depict festive celebrations, religious ceremonies, collective meals, and the natural world. You will see mountains, as mentioned before, skies, bodies of water, flora, and fauna. So each work represents a microcosm of time, of space, of racial dynamics, suggesting that she created from memory rather than direct observation. These compositions are rendered in clusters, creating spaces of friction and conflict as they were created at different moments, sometimes with different energies and dynamics in the direction of the threads. This effect is amplified by her use, and it's a good example here, of complementary colors and chromatic variation, as well as the energy motion of her needlework that you can see, for instance, on the body of the horse on the work on the left. Her compositions create the illusion of movement from their abundance of rhythms, with elements rendered in multi-directional stitches. Foregrounds and backgrounds melt into one another as she covers every inch with something of visual interest, using bold colors and assigning equal importance to diverse objects. Some parts, as you will see on the bottom left or the upper right of the right image, like some of the parts bleed into abstraction. I picked here two examples, and we have a line, a display with 5 works, but they are more in the exhibition, in which you have the recurrent motif, like of lakes and ponds, like you see in the central area of these two images. So these fascinating recurrent motifs appeared somehow as eye-shaped motif in which internal and external components occupy the same plane. We see a primordial broth of sorts composed of toy boats, as you see clearly on the left, and you can see all manners of birds and fish, flowers, seahorses, turtles, tadpoles, and even land animals. So it could refer, and we discussed, we don't have the answer, but we discussed that together. Would it be a motif that refers to homeland of Vitória da Conquista? Could it be the repetitive motif that she could have seen or beloved from her quotidian, and lakes that she could have brought like the kids to play nearby? So this is interesting that she has really reused over and over this motif, and creating situations where all of them are bleeding in some of, in abstractions. I'm going to pass it to Dylan here, where we have more examples of some of the scenes that could have been taken from the quotidian, but brought to a different stage.
Yeah, so the name of the first wall text that we have in this exhibition is called The Worlds Within. And I like that title because I think on the one hand it evokes the title of the whole exhibit, right? A head full of planets. And we might ask, what are those different planets that are occupying her head? And something that Valérie and I really talked about a lot as we went through these works was the ways that there's, as Valérie mentioned, there's these overlapping elements, memory, her current reality, and then also all of these imagined elements. So if you look at this embroidery that we have in front of us here, on the one hand, you might be tempted to say this is a memory of her time in Bahia. But I've highlighted two animals that we see here, one being this camel at the top right, and then on the bottom, I've highlighted this kind of stag with these big horns, and neither of them are animals that you're really going to be finding in the Brazilian countryside. Which again, I think is getting at the ways that she's inserting these imagined or fantastical elements into diverse Brazilian landscapes, or perhaps these are landscapes that don't exist in Brazil in her head, that they're kind of abstracted into a different place. Another thing that we can think about within her work is the way that she's reflecting on current reality. And so on the one hand, we know that she did sell some works, and we have one painting that we have displayed in the gallery space from the front in the back, where you can see that she wrote a price on the back. And so she was attentive to the economic reality of what she was producing. And also with that in mind, it's worth remembering that in her interview with Lélia Coelho Frota, she takes note of the fact that even though an embroidery took her more time to make, she could get more money when she sold it. And so these are works that are very much attuned to the economic reality around her. We should also note that she discusses in this interview how she says she would listen to radio while she was working. Popular artists like Roberto Carlos, and also that she was a fan of many male newscasters, which indicates that she was watching the news. And so she was also very much inserted in the political and cultural climate of her time. Also, as I mentioned, she made a number of works for specific people. Next slide. And so including for members of the family that she worked for. And so in this embroidery here, this one was created for the son of the Buarque de Faria family that she was working for. His name was Chico, and it was given to him upon his graduation from college with an engineering degree. And so in the bottom left, we see the number 55, which reflects the year he was born, 1955. And then the top left, you see the number 25, which is his age at the time of graduation. And what this work is really telling us is the story of his life until he got to graduation with an engineering degree. And so in the bottom right there, we see Chico perhaps in a crib or being born. Moving off to the left, we see him in a stroller, him beginning to walk. Then the timeline cuts across in an upward diagonal from the bottom left. And so you see him growing up. Right there next to the 55, you see a boy holding two tools in his hand, which on the one hand is reflecting his nickname, which was Chico Ferramental, which translates more or less to Chico the tool lover. So apparently he was always fixing things as a kid. It also echoes the fact that he would later become an engineer. Moving up on that diagonal, we see this figure with this boy in an orange shirt with red around his head, which apparently Madalena would tell him, don't run around so much because you're going to fall and hit your head and start bleeding. And so she stitches that moment into this work. And then as you continue upright, and then on the top row, you see him finally, as an adult, graduating with a degree. Next slide. And so another work that was created for a specific member of this family was created for Regina, who's someone I was able to interview this summer on the occasion of her wedding. And Madalena gifted her this work. She named it The Sun, the Moon, and the Stars, particularly with the idea that these celestial bodies would guide her on her path forward. She said, para que iluminem o seu caminho. So this is another work that's made for a specific current moment, but it's also interesting to see these rather abstract elements that emerge here, particularly in the bottom. It almost looks like a quilt or like a piece of modern art. And with that in mind, it's interesting to note that Lota de Macedo Soares, who was Elizabeth Bishop's partner in that first house, was a notable collector of Brazilian modern art as well as international modern art. And a lot of that work would have been in the home that Madalena was living in up until 1952. And so she would have crossed paths with names like Cândido Portinari, who's this kind of iconic name in Brazilian art. She would have seen the works of Burle Marx. She even would have seen the works of Alexander Calder, the American artist who had a relationship to Brazil, traveled there a few times, and who in 1959, there was a major exhibition of Calder at the Museum of Modern Art in Rio. And so Madalena would have inhabited the space, would have looked at the art on the wall, and would have begun to develop her own tastes about what she liked in terms of geometric abstraction. And so next slide. And the final note I'd like to make is that also in terms of inserting her into a bigger art world, but now specifically in terms of embroidery, is that so Madalena notes notes one real reason in the interview that she gave up painting, which is that she had an allergic reaction to paints. And apparently she would wear gloves all the time because she didn't want to show off her hands. And it was the mother of the Buarque de Faria family who suggested that she turn to embroidery, which again would have been a return to this practice that she would have learned from her own mother back as a child. And what's significant about this is that the mother in the Buarque de Faria family was at the time, they were based in Rio. Again, they had the summer house. And at the time, the mother was taking classes with Madalena Colasso, who at the time was one of the bigger names in Brazilian tapestry, who was quite literally credited for founding what's been called the Brazilian stitch. And so while we don't know if Madalena had specific contact with Colasso, it's at the very least an interesting fact that's further connecting Madalena to the wider kind of world on the one hand of modern art, but at the same time as more kind of mainstream tapestry making practices or embroidery practices. And I'll give it back to you, Valérie.
Yeah. So mostly figurative, but with a few ventures in geometric abstraction. As you see on the left, there are two examples in the exhibition. The textile works were referred to by the artist herself as tapeche, rugs, or as quadros de la, wool paintings. A choice of term that we can interpret as an attempt to uphold her textile works in parody to her paintings. Museums and collectors have described them as tapecherias, tapestry, bordados, embroideries, or textiles. But the embroideries that Santos Reinbolt began to produce in the 1960s exemplify the nuances of the Brazilian art historical narrative. The scholar Julia Brian Wilson, who wrote an essay on the artist in Massby's catalog, has pointed out that her works shared affinities with long-standing textile traditions practiced by women across Brazil who have worked with embroidery in the domestic sphere. And I would point out as well that in Brazil, Santos Reinbolt has long been associated with arte popular, a term that we can roughly assimilate with our use of folk art or self-taught art, for instance, which similarly refer to a vast group of works produced in contexts largely removed from the conventions of traditional art schools. Within the modernist area and movements that emerged in Brazil in the late 20s, artists and writers from the cultural elite began to incorporate indigenous and Black influences into their work. They had come to see the presence of these populations within Brazil's national borders as a part of what made Brazilian art different from from what was produced in the rest of the world. The cultural production of marginalized groups, and Madalena would be associated with that, became valued as a source for shaping national identity and a model for finding liberation from European traditions. Arte Popular was folded into this search for art that could be considered authentically Brazilian. I think it's important to situate our work within this vast tradition of influences and how until today you could imagine our work being cited and referred to by contemporary artists working within these traditions, even in a critical way. I'm looking at the work on the right here, and I talked about the aesthetics sometimes of our scenes diluting into or blending into abstraction, and we have a good example here with examples that could refer to the visual environment that or attempts in abstraction that would have been motivated by our exposure to modern art artists that were mentioned by Dylan, that would have been exposed to in the house of Lota de Macedo Soares and Elizabeth Bishop. So you have these examples, and this is definitely like an area of scholarship that would be expanded on Madalena. I'm going to turn our attention to a section of this last gallery that we decided to create to give a voice to Madalena through a performance, and I will let Dylan to explain the different components of this installation that were inspired and taken from the interviews, as we mentioned earlier, the only interviews that were captured by Coelho Frota in her publication Mito Poetica, and in which we see on the right a work with a tree, and this tree is referred to by Madalena herself in this interview. So Dylan, please explain to us how we have decided to take advantage of this content.
Yeah, so first I'd like to highlight that here on the right, we have this embroidery that Madalena referred to as the Pai Ba tree, Father Ba's tree, which was one of her works that made it to the Venice Biennial in 1978, which was the first exhibition of Madalena's work, posthumously, so just 2 years after she died. And that the curation of the Brazilian sample of works to make it to the Venice Biennial was done by Lélia Coelho Frota, who again is this art critic who was very interested in Brazilian arte popular or folk art, and who created this book, Mito Poética, that was published in 1975 that features an essay about Madalena. And it's from that essay that we get all of these quotations from Madalena, because Lélia Coelho Frota interviewed her twice. And then we don't have those original recordings, but we do have the quotations that Lélia found interesting and inserted into her essay as quotations to prove the diverse points that she was trying to make, which include elements like Jungian analysis. We wanted to try to free those quotes a little bit from the anthropologist and art critic's analysis by seeing what they look like if we take them out of that context and maybe give voice to them. And so that's exactly what we did. Valérie and I worked together to find a number of the quotes that were compelling, and we arranged them in an order that seemed to create a narrative. I then translated them from Portuguese into English, and we worked with a Bahian poet, Black feminist scholar, Luana Hayes, who teaches here at Princeton, where I'm currently based and doing doing my PhD work, and she recorded that. And so when you're visiting the space, you can listen to Luana speaking in an accent that perhaps is, we don't know what Madalena sounded like, but you can hear Madalena's quotes with an accent from Bahia, and you can see translations projected in the space. And then up on the wall, we have a number of archival photos that we were able to get from people who live nearby, as well as from the regional museum in the city that Madalena was born, the Vitória da Conquista Museu Regional, as well as photos of Loja de Marcelo Soares' home, and a number of other spaces that Madalena would have passed through. So it was a very exciting project for us to be able to work on as a means of trying to bring Madalena's voice and life into the exhibition in a way that goes a little bit beyond just the works that we have.
So before opening up to question, I just wanted to reemphasize that within the works, we could see potentially Madalena like inscribing herself into these scenes, but what she basically could suggest, it's like she bear witness to her own experiences and she inscribed herself onto history. And she did in a very specific way, in a repetitive way that is assertive and that is perceptible across the selection of the works that we made for this exhibition. So we are happy to answer any questions. And Mathilde, I will leave it open to you.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk and for introducing us to the work of Madalena Santos Reinbolt. It's so wonderful to have her at the museum at the moment, and I hope everyone on the call can come see the vibrant colors of her work. We have some questions. I'm going to kick off the Q&A with just a reflection on your collaboration with MASP. As you mentioned, the show was organized by MASP originally and then came to the US. And I was just wondering if you could talk about how you expanded on the MASP's presentation, what insight did you gain from your colleague at MASP, and also what kind of perspective do you bring as North American scholars and curators, and what the context of AFAM also bring to the work. So yeah, I would love to have you talk about the difference between the two shows.
Yes, so it was the first opportunity to display the works in a group, in a large retrospective in an American context. So we felt important to build upon that research that MASP did. They collide a lot of information they had access to. I mean, some of the text of Coelho Fruta is published in their catalog. They also work in collaboration with different scholars like Julia and others to really provide an exhaustive portrait as much as possible. And it's an ongoing research. And what we have tried to do is to adapt this content for American audiences. We are a specialized museum. MASP is a museum with a vast collection and an encyclopedic collection, if you want. And the way that the show was positioned within this context is totally different from ours. So being a specialized museum, it was important for us to situate the works of Madalena in the larger realm of arte popular, what it means here in the US versus what it means in Brazil, and maybe make some connections between the works of Madalena and other artists that could have similar ways of developing thematic compositions and areas of explorations, like build trailer, like I mentioned earlier. But that was important also to have a sense of what has been shown before, because it's always like we can talk about this exhibition being like the first presentation, but she has been collected, she has been exposed, she has been in dialogue with our present time, with important artist luminaries and cultural luminaries who have been creating opportunities for our works to travel and being seen in Brazil. So what we did was like we compiled this bibliography, exhibition history, where the works are, in which collections, and mainly they are in private collections, but they are 4 important museums in Brazil in which the works are conserved. So the goal was to better understand if these have been active channels, if they have developed various interpretation on these works. So situating the artists within our own context, trying to better understand how we can look at these works within a larger history of textile, for instance, look at this from a gender perspective, looking at this from a racial perspective was really providing, I think, a more informative context for an American public that is not familiar with our works. Dylan, do you want to add something?
No, I think you covered that pretty well. Yeah, I think that the big difference between the original Maspu exhibition, which was incredible as this kind of first moment that really kicked off this kind of newfound interest in Madalena because it was her first solo show. But the main, I think, work that we were doing is kind of trying to update their research and contextualize Brazil for an American audience that would have had, that has not just little knowledge about Madalena, but about Brazil itself. And so how can you bring this this artist to New York and make her legible for a public? Yeah.
And Dylan, Dylan has been on the field, meeting with also people, relatives, people where she had, it provide enormous context. And the slideshow that you have seen in the background of this installation are in some cases like images from the families where she lived. So real like sources, visual sources in our environment that could have been like, that could eventually lead to other interpretations and bring the research to a different area. But so these interviews are key because it allows they allow us to understand that real scenes were captured in our embroidery, but also real scenes combined with imagined landscapes as well, and some areas that are definitely like more abstract. That seems to be like another moment where she went through personal investigations of the materiality of the works that pose us as a challenge into reading the works like linearly. It's really like you realize that these works are these microcosmoses of time and space, and it helps us to read them from various layers.
Yeah, I would add that for me, being able to I interviewed, I believe, 7 people who knew her personally. And what that brought to me was a kind of sense of the person behind the work, the stories she had in mind, the ways that she was often creating very specific narratives behind a number of her works. And it also gave a greater sense of the conditions in which she was working, right? So this is maybe to help respond a little bit to Marilyn Schwartz's question about the freedom to go to museums in Rio. Um, there are 2 homes that she was living and working in Petrópolis. And so you have the first home by Lota de Macedo, that was owned by Lota de Macedo Soares, who I don't think Madalena was traveling to museums in Rio, but Lota was a major player in the Brazilian cultural scene in the 40s and 50s and through to the late 60s. She designed as an architect the what is I believe one of the largest outdoor seaside parks in the world. That's in Rio. It's called o Aterro do Flamengo. And she was very, very, very well connected to artists from the modern art world whose works she acquired and had all over her home. And so Madalena would have been coexisting with works of modern art by, again, everyone from huge names in Brazilian modern art to names like Alexander Calder. And there were also a number of works of folk art in the home. So Madalena had access to a lot of art that you could see. And then with regards to this notion of her having freedom to travel, again, I don't think she's probably traveling that far, but because in the second home was a vacation home, where the people who owned the home were not there all the time, she would have had many months of the year where she and her husband had a certain freedom to move beyond the house, who were to create art, who they were not necessarily restricted the whole time to doing these kind of menial duties for the owners of the home.
Please, maybe to another question, the relationship of Madalena to modernism and modernisms, we hosted at AFAM 2 years ago in conjunction with Maurice Hirschfeld exhibition, a symposium about the relationship between self-taught artists, self-taught arts, and modernisms, and which included a talk by Julia Bryan-Wilson on Santos Reinbolt. And I was wondering, how do you consider the relationship between the work, or how do you place the work of Santos Reinbolt in the movement of modernism, and maybe the movement Arte Popular, which has contributed grandly to the development of modernism in Brazil? I think it's another relationship is very different between self-taught artists and mainstream artists in Brazil. So I would love for you maybe to contextualize that for our audience.
I'd note that modernism has a very specific meaning in a Brazilian context, which is referring to a movement or an art movement that emerges in Sao Paulo in the 1920s, and which was a rather primitivist art movement. And so artists who are mostly white and men based in Sao Paulo or in Rio, who are taking inspiration from the massive Black and indigenous populations, as well as from the creative works created in rural and poorer contexts. And so the way that difference has a difference a bit from primitivism in a European context would be that it's a way of thinking about national identity, in the sense that we are all Brazilians, right? Me in Sao Paulo and someone producing in the Amazon, we can all be part of this, of what it means to be Brazilian, and what it means to create in a Brazilian way and to generate Brazilian aesthetics.
Yeah, liberated from the urban traditions.
Yeah, and so in that sense, increasingly Madalena has been referenced as an artist associated to traditions of arte popular, which is a contested term in Brazil through to this day. But at her time, she was generally referred to as a primitive, which would have been used in the same way that today we refer to as naive. But basically the idea being that this was a good thing, right? Her art is free of the kind of contaminating elements that would have come from mixing with kind of more academic art, or from Western art traditions. Whereas our exhibition, I think, the research Maspi is doing, it shows the way that she was not at all removed, but rather integrated into these artistic traditions via the presence of all this art in her home. And finally, I'd like to note that today in Brazil, there's been a big push towards no longer talking about modernism as a singular word, but rather to think about modernisms in the plural, as a way to bring in these different artistic practices that were in their own way reflecting on a modern day Brazil, but from their own different positionalities. And so I think modernisms in the plural is one way that artists like Madalena are beginning to be brought into the fold of kind of more mainstream art today.
Thank you so much for these explanations. I'm going to take more questions from our audience. We have questions around the stitches. I know you have a little bit of information, you shared a little bit of information about the stitches, but Do we know how Madalena obtained her supplies, and also what type of stitches did she use? So it's a technical question. If you have a little bit more information about this to share.
As we mentioned at some point, I think it was during Dylan's explanation about the type of representation she did on some surfaces, but so she was encouraged to stitch on fabric initially. I think it's also something that referred to a previous profession she had in various families to create towels, and it refers also to her uprising on a farm, making blankets and lace, and so she learned her craft within a more traditional context. But she really eventually, when she had the opportunity to make something more personal, and she expressed disliking also, or not liking necessarily create on this type of material, and then when she decided to invest like burlap, this is also a question of access that we can also ask ourselves. In this specific context, we know that she was getting this primary source, this primary material from the neighborhood store. She could like buy like, or get recycling if you want, sacks that she would open and work from. So she mentioned that that was like her favored material if you want to create our embroidery. So of course we can imagine, when we look at the surface of the burlap, how it allows her to be more dynamic, more expressive. Maybe it translates better the effect and the vibrancy of what she wished to obtain visually. But it's also a question of access. And it's a question of also surface. The surface of the work is maximized.
In terms of where she was getting works, I think it's important to remember that, right? So she's working again in the home of people who have respect for folk art and who have respect for art and are recognizing her as a great artist. So we have featured in our exhibit this quote from Elizabeth Bishop saying that Madalena's works are better than Candido Portinari's works. And so they begin, it seems that Lota de Macedo Soares began to help connect her to different art dealers where she could sell some of her paintings. And that even after Madalena left, or was fired from Lota and Elizabeth's house, that she moved to this other home, Lota would have continued to help support her, as would other people in the community. And so if you watch the film Reaching for the Moon, which tells the story of the romance between Lota de Macedo Soares and Elizabeth Bishop, there's also a third American in that, or a second American in that story, who was Lota's first lover, named Mary Morse. And it seems that after, this is from testimony from Mary Morse's daughter, Monica, it seems that after Madalena left the Lota's house, Mary truly kind of took up the case of bringing her paints and threads. In this second home, Madalena also lived across the street from a huge collector and dealer of arte popular named Ivani Bolsas, who also appears to have perhaps helped her out with her production or helped connect her to the market. And so I think it's interesting because Madalena is, on the one hand, on the outskirts of Rio. She's far from the kind of mainstream art traditions, but at the same time, she's in these network of artists and figures who do want to support her because they recognize her as a great talent.
Which is also respond to another question we had about the exhibition history, if the work was shown during a lifetime. So if I understand, the work was not shown during a lifetime, but was circulating among collectors. Do you want to say a few words before we close about that, about so where the work was circulating and its exhibition history, which is something that you also focused on a bit in the exhibition?
Yeah. Just one little, it seems like it seems like maybe some of her works are displayed in local churches during her life. Way more research needs to be done on that. But again, she passed away in 76. In 78, her works made it the biennial. And then, as Valerie mentioned earlier, we have a QR code in the exhibit where you'll be able to see a whole list of most of the exhibitions in which she was featured. And between her death and the early 2000s, she appeared here and there. There was some interest around her work. But it's truly in the last 5 years or so since Vilma Age put on an exhibition in, I believe it was 2020, that featured one of her works, that there's been this kind of explosive interest in Madalena. And so in the last 5 years, there have been over 15 exhibitions of her work, which include at MoMA last year, one of her works was featured in the Crafting Modernity exhibition. There was another exhibition in New York. She was just in London. And so she is having this kind of boom in interest. And maybe Valerie could speak to that a tiny bit more as well.
Yeah, one thing that I mentioned at the beginning is that so the show included 42 works, paintings and embroideries, more embroideries and paintings. But this exhibition, since 2020-22, the exhibition at MASP has also generated interest for her works. And we can suspect that it's going to eventually create a resurgence of rediscoveries of her works that were like collected at the time, but maybe not exhibited, that we are not aware of. But for now, the output that we have in the gallery is half of what has been identified so far, so which is about 90 works. When we took the show from MASP and we look at the inventory of works, it was closer to 70. So it means like the research has grow already, and we were able to identify more works.